Welcome back, everyone, to Random's Thoughts. Today we're jumping into another solo arena run that got me 7 wins. Now, I wanted to take a little bit of time at the beginning to, well, show off the build that we utilize. This is an aggressive Majus Soldiers deck that was actually provided by Midgeworth. So shout out to Midgeworth for suggesting this. We did have a couple of changes to the original list that he had provided simply because, well, I didn't have the cards. And realistically, I think there are still a number of, we'll say, modifications that can be made to the list because I noticed some things being very clunky just both on ladder as well as through the course of the arena run. But since it was successful, I did want to highlight it. And realistically, although we have A2 unlocked, you don't actually need it. You're just spamming A1 on cooldown, essentially. And most of this list is, well, let's face it, it's common and basic cards for the most part. There's a couple rares, there's some epics, and it could obviously be improved with other cards at the higher rarities, but you can definitely 7-0 the arena with this particular deck. Now, I'll save the full deck breakdown for another time once I actually hit Diamond with this particular deck, but let's jump into the arena run itself. So we're going to go through each of the different fights that I had encountered while we were playing Majus. Now, this is a different setup than what I had when I ran through with other champions. So as you can see, we're picking the Midge Soldiers deck as I have it labeled because, well, that's the focus for this one. And we're going directly into the mirror right off the bat. Now, this is kind of an awkward opener, but we're easily able to mulligan away into a, well, at least keeping the Naval Conjurer. The problem here is it's still somewhat clunky. We don't have a quote-unquote true threat initially, but the fact that Majus draws us cards allows us to get out of it. Now, realistically, we should have drawn the card first to see if we had a better option, but we were able to conjure a cavalry, which is spectacular. We wanted to find those anyway, and we draw a second one here. So I'm not really worried that anything's going to go wrong in this match. It's really just a matter of curving out and placing your minions appropriately. What do I mean by that? Well, you want to set up a charioteer or other buffs so that way you get maximum value out of them. So you tend to want to play in 1, 3, and 5, the respective lanes or columns, however you want to call it, for this particular deck. The placement does matter a lot. Now, I was electing here to go for the cost-reducing soldiers so that we had some options there. But you can see I'm debating a little bit. Do we play this? Do we not? It can't really go in front of the other enemies because, well, it will just die immediately. But instead, we're going to end up continuing to advance our board, and setting up these cavalries is really what you want to do. Obviously, with speed, they get extra benefit from pumping out buffs. The bodies are pretty sizable on their own. Now, I elected to go with Charioteer here in order to get the immediate, well, maybe not the immediate, that's the wrong way to put it, the more extensive buff first. We can then play our attack buffing soldier later, such as now. The Field Sergeant comes out and buffs more things. Now, unfortunately, it's not going to end up fighting the 6-3, now 7-3 that was opposing it, but the fact of the matter is that we're pushing so much damage, we have a bunch of speed minions, our opponent is not likely to be able to really contest the existing minions that we have on the board unless they manage to actually kill them out of combat. So at this point, we're just trying to keep pressuring. We have a pretty substantial life lead. Draw cards. We're arcane overloading here just to try and clear that out. Of course, naturally, we find the mana burn on top. Everybody who's played Arcane Overload has those games in their memory. But we're able to keep pushing damage with everything. And that's all this deck wants to do, is continue threatening. You don't have a lot of ways to deal with things outside of combat, so it's imperative that you're able to buff everything up because you don't really rebuild well. Your minions are relatively sturdy. As you can see, they have, well, because of the speed, they have decent attack, but they have a decent backside. You can see on the cavalry in the middle has a 5 health, so it could hypothetically survive, although it wouldn't come from Majus, but a Desert Twister, for example. And you can buff up your minions so that they end up surviving a lot of removal, or a lot of potential removal, a lot of potential sweepers. But once you lose your board, it's very difficult to come back. So you want to make sure that you're continuing to apply pressure. Don't give your opponent an opportunity to breathe. But as you can see, we end up closing the game out here with the mana burn and are able to take the victory. As I said at the beginning, I wasn't really concerned about any of this, and really we were able to take it down without really breaking a sweat. With one win under our belt, we're now jumping into our second game. Obviously, I want to try and focus on keeping the same deck. We're not making any changes here. So we're up against Tessa. There's the potential here that our opponent will be able to clear a lot of our stuff, quote-unquote, easily due to their A1 and the ability to draw potentially some really mean things out of either realm due to their A2. But we do have a pretty strong opener being able to dump the peasant recruits onto the board. Ideally, we can grow them out of control, but one thing I want to point out here with the Naval Conjurer is because this deck is mostly bodies, you tend to want to try and find things that allow you to interact out of combat. You're not actually featuring Sever the Source main deck, so finding those is great. Here, we're taking the Corruption ability, Corruption spell, and unfortunately we get our board cleared early on, which is a little awkward. Now, it may seem like a mistake that I'm playing the 1-2 in front of the body that just killed it, the previous one, but here I just want to leave the lanes open so that we can build out future buff turns. Since we also had the ability to play the double hired steel, I didn't want to risk that there was blood getting lost on future turns. Now, we didn't find a great buff minion here. Obviously, we could have played the +1 attack, which may have been better, but I elected here to go with the Zephyr Knight to try and control the board a little bit more. What I've found and what I've mentioned before is that if you don't allow the AI to ever have a board, most of the time they just can't do anything of value. So we ended up getting another, going back a couple turns, a relatively useless Conjure in the Unruly Spirit, but we're again pressuring. We have mostly control of the board, so it's just a matter of continuing to maintain that board presence. Here we're able to advance the cavalry, buff our soldiers. Unfortunately, we are leaving some of them out. There's an argument to be made, going back to what I was saying earlier, just play the Molliser, maybe play the Mana Burn in order to clear some of these things, but a lot of this entire run, as silly as it sounds, feels like it was going through the motions. Basically, at no point did I ever feel threatened by anything the AI was doing. So while they're able to clear some things, they're able to present threats, occasionally, quote-unquote threats, we're able to continue pressuring, continue building up our board, keep things on the board that they have to address. The Arcane Overload here actually was relevant as compared to the previous one that hit the Mana Burn. But as you can see, it's very easy to put them at a low life total. We're able to aim a huge Mana Burn at their face and once again take down another victory. So after being 2-0, we're up into the third game. This is Darlock, where I expected going in that there was going to be more resistance. Darlock is very commonly played as a control deck. It has the ability to heal. It could relatively easily remove most of our minions, or I was expecting it to be able to between myth damage, myth sweepers, the shadow damage and sweepers and removal, so I was a little concerned. Additionally, our hand was kind of clunky, but we are able to mana orb out a cavalry, which is, I'm happy about it. Now, this is kind of a weird turn. Turn 3 playing Molliser naked like that, well, maybe not naked because we did have a soldier. It's a little awkward. We obviously are vulnerable to the A1. There was maybe an argument to inspire to arms instead so that we clear out the zombie, therefore wouldn't be removing the cavalry, and this may have been a mistake. So my debate here with the Captain of the Guard is mostly centered on where are my buffs going to be next turn, and do we care about blocking that zombie? Now, since they played the Harpy, and again, we don't have, realistically, any out-of-hand removal in this deck by default, we were kind of in some trouble. The Sever does allow us to potentially remove things, so that's why I wanted it. The crab creature's clearly going to eat things. The Mummy is actually now a threat, and I'm going to pause here because Mummy typically is so tempo negative that it's very difficult to get it online. Your opponent has a whole turn to address it. You really need to be in a solid position in order to play it onto an empty board, or maybe not an empty board, but an advantageous board so that your opponent can't ever get going, because the Mummy debuffs will ensure that you're able to control combat. Here is one of those situations where ultimately, yes, we'll be able to combat remove the Harpy. but we don't really have Rush. Well, we had Molisairs, we don't right now. We just don't have a whole lot of options to remove it, so it's going to be very awkward. Or at least, so I was thinking at the time. So we do make the appropriate play here and draw first, just to see if we find anything else of value. We can sever. We were hoping to land it on probably the Gorgon Sister, so that way we can deal with the Mummy more quickly. But unfortunately, we're kind of stuck. We will be able to remove the Harpy, but this is why we had to play the Treason. We needed that Mummy gone to ensure that we're not hemorrhaging board state. We're not slowly getting our board state bled out. But it now left us, because Darlock was able to remove our minion in the center lane, with a very awkward position. We had no board. Which, as I mentioned, this deck does not rebuild well. While this board seems okay, that Plague Swarm immediately makes it look terrible. Like, look at this. We're going to lose the Hired Steel. We have Peasant Recruit that may or may not be worthwhile because it could be running into the counter there. We do have the Molisaire, which allows us to do some things. So I was debating where and what needed to be removed. We should have drawn the cards first. Again, you want to draw the cards first, see what your options are, unless you know you're not doing anything. I didn't feel the need to play the second Inspire. We're just looking to clear stuff out here. But unfortunately, they left remnants behind via that skeleton. So we are way behind, if you look at it, 47 to 79. And we're going into, well, it's turn 9 now, going to be shortly turn 10. But we are able to set up a pretty solid Zephyr Knight. And the reason we're Zephyr Knighting here is because we have the Charioteer, we're able to play it in the middle and buff the Zephyr Knight. While it's not a soldier, it does have speed. So again, you want to be looking for ways to try and buff your speed minions as best you can. They are your biggest threats. You don't have a ton of blitz. You don't have a ton of reach as far as burn or other ways to close the game. But blitz can put a hurt on your opponent, and very quickly. If they don't quickly remove things, they may never be able to outside of combat. Or excuse me, in combat. They will require outside of combat. So just like that, all of a sudden, we close the gap. We have a very threatening board. Our opponent's out of cards. And there's not a whole lot that they can do really to contest us. So this is just a sequencing thing. There's an argument that maybe I should have played the Mana Burn. There are a number of games through this run where I could have easily played Mana Burn and ended a game either the next turn or on the turn that the Mana Burn should have been played to close the game out. And again, it goes back to, I'll be honest, I didn't really need to worry about just about anything for this. There was really no contest, and that's why I felt that this build, and still feel that this build, whether you improve it or not, is a spectacular one for the arena. So we're on to our fourth battle. Still running with the same soldier build. Again, there were no changes made throughout this run, and we're up against Dawn. This opener was kind of clunky, but turns into something that I'm a little more comfortable with. The problem is that we don't have an immediate follow-up for the recruit in soldier form. Obviously, the Molisaire can get in immediately, but here we're able to dig for the Hired Steel, which now we're improving our board position across the board. This is where there's an interesting decision to be made. We could Molisaire, but I choose to run out the cavalry even though it's going to get hit so that we preserve the peasant recruit. It doesn't quite pan out because of the Mastodon, but I think that is correct. Now this is another one where we have a few different options, but playing the captain is both more mana efficient now and more mana efficient later because of the cost reduction. We only land it on a single minion, but having it only cost 2 opens up a variety of different options on turn 5 and further down the line. So it would appear that we made somewhat of a mistake because we didn't play the Conjure 2-drop to get the buff there, but I wanted to leave that lane open for future buffs. Obviously Zephyr Knights, plus getting the Inspire out felt more appropriate on that turn. Maybe it would have been better to Conjure. But realistically at this stage, we're just pressuring. I've yet to encounter, and I don't think through this entire run I encountered really any board clears from the AI. So it was very much just, we're going to play our hand out and we're going to end the game before you can do anything of value. And that's basically what happened here. Like I said, We finish it with another mana burn. It's becoming cliche at this point, but we just pummel people with speed soldiers and then close the game out. Now, bout number 5 is standing before us, and we're going to jump in against Faith. This hand is kind of like one of the earlier ones where we're fine keeping the Explorer, but we mulligan into something that's still kind of clunky. We don't have Peasant Recruit on 1. We don't have a 3 to follow it up. Our 2-drop isn't super threatening. And while the Hoplite there isn't super threatening itself, it's also going to be a little difficult to remove. On top of it, we end up getting a very awkward Conjure. Shield Bash does basically nothing. Shield Formation is okay, but we take the Priestess here. Not spectacular. Now, our turn 3, as mentioned, is kind of awkward. And I was debating what to remove here. In retrospect, it probably would have been worth removing the Recruit, as you'll see, but I felt that we were better off trying to remove the slightly larger guy under the assumption that the Recruit wouldn't grow that quickly. Unfortunately, that Blessed Bond means that it's much larger than I expected, so now we have a potentially growing threat, as well as an existing sizable one. Now, part of that decision process was because we're playing against the AI. Both the builds are usually not spectacular, and their play patterns leave much to be desired. So I was taking chances that you probably can't ordinarily take if you against a player, a human. If you see an opposing Peasant Recruit, you kind of have to remove it to prevent something terrible from happening. But here, we're just trying to make our most efficient plays. There is an argument that maybe we could have done something, you know, if we played the Charioteer elsewhere, reorganize the Hired Steel, maybe try and fight the Recruit, but I kind of felt that it was too large at this point to realistically make a difference. Now, one thing I'll point out here is I was debating between the Zephyr Knight and the Arcane Overload. The reason I ended up going this particular route, which we'll keep it playing so you can see, is that this way, when we play the follow-up Zephyr Knight, on top of the fact that maybe we get lucky and remove things, which we weren't going to on the Peasant Recruit without help, but the Zephyr Knight could be played as a follow-up and we maintain the body instead of throwing it in front to chump block. But we utilize the mana burn here to clear the board. Again, that was just kind of a concession to clear the AI's board. I don't think it's necessary. We had a much better clock, a much better board position. It didn't feel that we were all that threatened. It would have been bad if, for example, we chose not to remove it and then we got hit with a board clear and then we had to rebuild, plus seeing the large Peasant Recruit there, but I didn't really think that was going to happen. So at this stage, again, we're in the position, we're playing downhill, we have a great board position. I know I'm being a broken record to some extent, but the only thing scary that happens here is this commander coming down. And even then, is it really that scary? We have a 4-5 with speed, we have a 5-7, and the Charioteer almost takes down the commander on its own. Now, I'm electing to buff our speed minion because buffing speed minions is great, obviously. But this follow-up from the AI could have been scary if this happened several turns earlier. But that's the advantage of the aggro decks, is that you just don't give your opponents time to breathe. It's cool and all that you have this deck full of powerful 10-drops. You might get to play one of them. And realistically here, as you can see, I'm just kind of playing things out for funsies. None of that end of the game was really necessary. Just playing stuff for the sake of playing stuff. So we're on to our next to last fight. We're up against Keeper, who also tends to have much more anti-aggro tools than the average deck. So we're trying to make sure that we have a solid early board position, and we do mulligan into arguably the best opener we could have. We have the Peasant Recruits ×2 on 1. We have a follow-up 2-drop. We make the correct play and draw first. And then we find a Cavalry off the Conjure. This is a pretty spectacular opener. So the debate here is, do we advance the Cavalry or do we try and play Hired Steel plus the Molisar? The Cavalry seems better, although it's in an awkward spot because by being in 2 and 4, until that minion in 5, the Conjure minion, was removed, we didn't really have a space to play a buff minion, which is part of my debate here also with the Molisar. But realistically, we have such an advantageous board position that I just don't care. Now, one thing I will pause and mention here is that we did get very lucky because we did have the Inspires in hand. If we did not have the Inspires and we instead had the Field Sergeant, we didn't have a place to play the Field Sergeant in order to buff our minions, and those Plague Swarms would have been ridiculous. So while that could be construed as a misplay, we did have the cards in hand, so I wasn't really worried at the time. And in this case, it could have been even worse for our opponent, but it's going into turn 6. They're at 32. We have 2 4-attack speed minions and a 7 and 8 peasant recruit. That's pretty mean. Now, of course, if we were playing against a human or a better keeper build in general, they could have Desert Twistered the last turn and we would have been forced to rebuild. But because of the pressure that we were applying, we've just been drawing cards and banking them. So we could have just plopped our entire hand on the board after that, but instead we just make mincemeat out of keeper. And oh look, we get Ascension, by the way, it was cool to get that pack. We do have some Ascended packs to open, but that's for another time. So we're on to the final boss, Sakara. Based on the way this run has gone, I was really there was no concern in my mind. This opener also seemed okay. You know, we didn't have the crazy peasant recruit opening, but we did have a 2-drop to curve into a 3 to curve into a 4. We could even mana orb out the 4-drop to make our other stuff cost less. And in fact, I was debating doing some other stuff, but ultimately, we're going to try and get the cavalry online as soon as possible. Reason being is we want to just be able to buff it. It is the biggest threat. It has a big enough back end that typically we're not too worried. Now, this particular conjure wasn't thrilling, but we're able to advance our board again. We have a bunch of threats. Since Sakara did not remove the cavalry, we're able to set up the charioteer, and we even managed to survive the arcane overload, which was very, very fortunate. And we're planning on playing the charioteer again. Like, this board, I feel great until that happened. The second Arcane Overload was very concerning because now we're down to a single minion. While the Arcane Overload did not remove everything cleanly, it did set it up so that the Satyr could make some gains. Now, the decision for the placement here is really just getting rid of the mana generator is going to be more important. But similar to some of the previous games that we ultimately ended up winning, we're not looking great here. We are pretty far behind, both on board and in life total, so we need to make something happen. We do have an Arcane Overload of our own. We do have the mana burn in hand, so we don't have to worry as much about the potential of... Well, we don't have to worry about all the potential. Oops, we hit our 0 cost, and suddenly we do nothing. Sakara's doing Sakara things, transforming their minions. They still have a chunky board. We do find a Treason, which is decent. You know, we have one of our 5 costs in hand, so we're not expecting that everything was going to die, but it gave you some options. One thing I'll call out here is the Unruly Spirit gets placed here just to soak a little bit more damage. You could make an argument that we should have placed it in front of the mana generator in 3, so that it could potentially hit the 5, but it could also end up hitting the mana generator face or any other minions that get played. So the Sakara deck is kind of running out of cards at this stage, but again, sizable board position. We're at 26, which means that we don't really have a whole lot of extra turns, but we do have removal in the form of Treason. Not the most exciting thing, but we knew we were going to be able to Zephyr Knight away a few things, and I wanted to set up being able to remove the Angel cleanly, so it was kind of what we needed to do. Unfortunately, the Transform gets us an Executioner, so we're hemorrhaging more board position. But we're going to go ahead and conjure stuff. Conditioning isn't thrilling, but it's something. We're able to buff all of our guys, continue pushing damage, but there are blockers in the form of the Nile Princess that are pretty large. Meaning that we're not pushing face damage, and I was sweating it a little bit that we were getting so low at 14 here. Granted, the Sakara deck can't transform those princesses, so we're not worried about it suddenly morphing into some random god or something that's going to annihilate us. But despite being so low, we were able to drag our opponent that low and then set up the now cliched mana burn. to be able to take down a victory. So that was pretty fun. I'm going to jump into some final thoughts about how this whole arena run went. So as you could tell, this was a pretty successful run. Granted, the builds we were playing against were not spectacular, and that kind of was exacerbated by the fact that we just didn't give the AI a chance, a popsicle's chance in hell. We just overwhelmed them at pretty much every turn and annihilated them from boss 1 to boss 7. Now, were there a couple games in there where it was closer than I would have liked? Yes. And ultimately, as I mentioned at the top, I think there are changes that could be made to this deck. But if you're looking for a low essence cost build that is very aggressive and is going to score you wins in the arena, I think you'd be hard pressed to find something more efficient than this. And as you could tell, I made a bunch of play errors that I even knew they were happening at the time. And it's just like, you know what? I'm going to win anyway, so I don't care. And that's kind of how it went down throughout the whole thing. But if you enjoyed this, want to see more arena runs, more Runestrike content, make sure you hit that subscribe button down below. Definitely check out my live Twitch stream where we're going to be playing a lot more Runestrike. And that'll do it for this time. As always, everybody, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. And Black Lives Matter.